Hi guys, and welcome back to another video where I talk to you, but you can't talk back to me. My name is Jason Samosa. You also have a name, but unfortunately, it's not easy for me to understand exactly what that is right now. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I think is one of the most fascinating questions in the world of ufology, and that is, why is disclosure even happening at all right now? Why is it that everybody's talking about UFOs? Why did that seem to start in a big way around 2016 and 2017? And what could the possible motivations and reasons be for that? What are the possible time constraints or activities or events that are driving this forward? Because no one's telling us exactly what those are. But there are people out there who know. There's going to be somebody who said, yeah, it's time, let's push the button. But the question is, why was it time? Why was it time in 2016, 2017? What is the secret behind UFO disclosure? And to explain this, to talk about this, I have prepared this in an iceberg format, meaning that we're going to start at the top at the most common sense, sort of normal explanations about why UFO disclosure might be happening. And we are going to move down further and deeper into the more profound and strange and frankly disturbing, bizarre and existential theories that have been postulated over the last number of years. And when I say postulated, I'm not just talking about someone saying like, maybe it's this. I'm talking about people from the defense and intelligence community who have hinted in this direction. But with all of that said, let's get started. But just before we do, I very rarely ask people to subscribe and to like and comment and all of that stuff. But I'm going to ask today, if you're enjoying these videos or if it's your first time and you're into this stuff, subscribe, like, write a comment. It really helps. It really, really helps. And I'm really grateful. And if you don't want to do it, that's absolutely fine. Back to the thing that you're here for. So at the very top of this iceberg, we have quantum and AI thrown right at the top here. So why is this at the very high end? As a society, we're about to reach a sort of an apex moment where not only are we creating quantum computers, which, by the way, quantum computers are not just faster, they're categorically different in terms of how they operate. They can do certain types of things profoundly faster than this is why you talk about a quantum leap, right? It's not just the next generation. It takes us generations and generations ahead. Computational power is about to explode. In fact, it already is in a lot of places. Google released that amazing chip that could do more in like a few hours than the entire history of the universe with a previous type of computer.
Now, the latest development from Google that it describes as a state-of-the-art quantum computer chip. The company claims Willow leapfrogs over the supercomputers that we used to consider the world's fastest, and it takes 5 minutes for them to solve a problem that would currently take supercomputers 10 septillion years.
Mind-blowing. But we also have these AI models that obviously run on computation, but also have a software element that is constantly being improved as well. The combination of these two things enables us to solve problems that would have taken us thousands of years to work out. And hey, one of those problems is, how do I sift through all of the chaotic data around the UFO issue? There is an embarrassment of riches in terms of data, stories, and, anecdotes around UFO disclosure and UFO events. But it's almost impossible for any singular researcher to actually dig into it all. But an artificial intelligence could scrape the web, could suck up all the information, and potentially might be able to sift through all of that. What if one of the motivations for disclosure is this idea that actually a quantum-powered artificial intelligence might, in 10, 20 years, just be able to figure it out, and that may not be under the control of the defense and intelligence community? Now, that is just a guess, right? I don't think anyone has said that this is why it's happening, but an interesting theory nonetheless. These examples of quantum and AI, I hope, give you an idea of how this external compelling event could drive urgency to say we need to proactively disclose, because otherwise this information is going to be forced out by people we have no control over. Looking at that top layer as well, there are other issues that are articulated there. One is just this idea that disclosure activism has actually played a successful role in UFO disclosure. So it's totally possible that there is no external compelling event, there is no time constraint that is forcing disclosure, but that rather 80 years of constant activism and pushing by those who want transparency has finally worked, that this has finally pushed the topic over the edge, and that's why we are having disclosure. Personally, I don't think that is a tenable theory, because I think disclosure comes with so many risks that activism alone wouldn't drive the ultimate revelation of non-human intelligence and all of the baggage that comes with that, right? So although I think that's possibly a factor, I don't think it could be a fundamental theory. When I say it's a factor, I suspect disclosure activism has pushed, and given the time constraint, whatever that time constraint is, which we're discussing today, disclosure activism pushed people to realize we need to act now because we don't have that much time. And yeah, people are right, we need to do something, whatever the motivation is for that. So disclosure activism definitely plays a part in why this is happening, but whether it's the fundamental driver, I would doubt that. Personally, I don't know, but personally, that's my perspective. Next up, the idea of global disclosure. I think this is actually more compelling. When I was doing my research on Bill Clinton and Podesta and all of the disclosure activities they went through, I became familiar with work in the 2000s that involved James Fox and Leslie Kean, and John Podesta was supporting that. And that led to Leslie Kean's book, Generals on the Record, UFOs. I can't remember the exact name, but it was about, it said UFOs in the title, big breakthrough book, which had the testimony of generals, pilots, politicians talking about UFOs. And as she did that, that was actually the result of her pulling together people from all around the world. There were people from France who represented UFO research there. There was the government and pilots of South America. There were people from the United Kingdom, people from certain European countries, from Canada, from all these different nations who came together and were saying, hey, we want to be proactive about disclosure. And many of these representatives from different countries were saying, we want to be transparent. Let's start working together to be transparent, whether or not the United States comes with us. Now, that kind of dialogue actually can be quite powerful, because for all of the control the United States has and the Five Eyes have on this topic, what if enough different countries were just beginning to be more and more gradually transparent? Would that potentially push the United States to say, hey, you know what? We're just fighting a losing battle here. Let's be proactive alongside other nations that may be being proactive. All very well, the United States defense and intelligence community saying, hey, we're going to prevent this from coming out. But in reality, you're not the only horse in town. There are other people who have a stake in this. And certainly that UFOs book that Leslie Kean wrote was really the coalescence of so many different nations, so many people from different backgrounds coming together saying, we want to talk about this. We have different nations who are trying to be transparent. Very interesting moment. That's the top layer done. Let's get down a layer, because this is where it really begins to get even more interesting. The next point on the iceberg is the idea that the program is leaking, and potentially has leaked enough that the people running it have said, we can't keep this safe. We may just need to start talking about this because we keep getting discovered. The first time I really considered this was actually when Richard Dolan made a video, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and he made that off the back of Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science Volume 5 journals. Fantastic journals, by the way, if you're into this topic. Full of amazing detail and context that just brings the UFO history to life. And in Vallée's journals, he is recounting all of his studies, his experiences, his conversations from the year 2000 to 2009. And in those journals, he highlights 3 instances where the program was discovered by someone in the defense and intelligence community, some senior person. Now, most of us will be familiar with the Admiral Tom Wilson story, where off the back of the kind of Clinton disclosure, Greer and Edgar Mitchell went to Admiral Tom Wilson, who I believe at that point was the deputy director of the DIA, told him about all of this stuff and said, you should know about this. And so he goes off looking, and he stumbles into the program after going through the Special Access Program Oversight Committee files, asking a few people. He eventually managed to identify it. He managed to meet up with these people and have a conversation with the program director, a lawyer, and someone else. They didn't let him in because he wasn't permitted, but they wanted to have a conversation to find out, how did you find out about us? This is concerning. Very interesting story. I won't recount the whole thing here. What's amazing in the journals of Jacques Vallée is he highlights 2 other instances where high-ranking intelligence officials also accidentally stumbled across this program. One was, I think, General Jack Sheehan, who I think was a NATO general. And then there was Charles Bauscher, I think, who was some financial controller at the Pentagon. And in both instances, I think financial anomalies and maybe some couple of backroom conversations led them to discover the program too. If that's true, there are 3 instances where the program, which supposedly has a budget 3 or 4 times its own operational budget in terms of security, right? So its security and counterintelligence budget is like significantly higher than the actual money being spent to reverse engineer and do all those things. So those programs are being uncovered multiple times, and who knows when else, maybe by like foreign adversaries. And maybe it got to a point where they thought, well, the money we're spending, it doesn't matter what we do, we still keep getting uncovered. Maybe it's time to change the approach. So could that be a driver for disclosure, that no matter the resources that are being thrown at securing this program, it keeps getting discovered? An interesting theory. Again, not convinced that that is the fundamental driver, but one that's worth considering. Now, this next one I think is really important as well. It's this idea that trust in the government has reached a breaking point. The idea that the lies that are built on top of other lies, that are built on top of other lies, have reached a point where it's no longer sustainable, where trust in the government from society is breaking down to such an extent that the fundamental modus operandi has to be changed. That the way that the government relates to the public has to be augmented in order for the government to remain as the authority in Western society. Let's think about what happened with Vietnam, with Watergate, with all of these events that led people to lose trust in the government and in the defense and intelligence community. The church hearings where MK Ultra came out and the CIA was exposed as really just being a rogue agency. You know, that was a whole history that people like myself, we just grew up with that in the background. But then you come to 2003, you've got 9/11, and then you've got this pivot to we need to invade Iraq. And it turns out the whole planet is sensible, rational, and doesn't want war. That's one of the most beautiful things when you actually pay attention to the reality of people. They don't want war. We don't want to fight. And so what happened in response to the idea that we would go to war in Iraq was the largest democratic protests in human history. In human history. All around the world, people said, we don't want to go to war in Iraq. But we still went. On the basis of intelligence that no one was allowed to see. There was this dossier. Here in the United Kingdom, I think only a small splattering of people saw it. No one in Parliament could see it, apart from the Prime Minister. And so we were all obliged to go to war on the basis of this intelligence, which supposedly showed we were all under a massive threat. And of course, now we know there were no weapons of mass destruction, or at least not the kinds that we thought, or that they were suggesting they were talking about, which we'll maybe come back to later. But there were no weapons of mass destruction in the conventional sense. We were tricked into a war, which not only cost us huge amounts of money, which has continued to push us further and further into a debt-fueled society, but has also led to the suffering and deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And also just led to the rise of ISIS. And then that withdrawal from Afghanistan a few years ago. The situation of what the government is pushing us into on the basis of intelligence is so bad, it's so blatant, that it's no wonder people are losing trust. And it's no wonder we have things like Brexit, the rise of Donald Trump, this contrarian politics, this desire to basically screw with the system. I think a great example of that here in the UK actually must have been a decade ago now, just prior to Brexit. This boat was being commissioned. It was given to the public via social media to say, hey, vote for the name that you want for this boat. I still love this. I think one of the options was the SS David Attenborough, very British, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure there was like a Queen Elizabeth thing because we Brits can't stop fantasizing about the Queen and the King. Different topic for a different day. But one of the suggestions that was put forward by the British community was Boaty McBoatface. Boaty McBoatface. And I can't figure out whether that name is everything that's right with this country or everything that's wrong. And you know, the way I see that is the sign of a society that feels so disempowered that whenever we get an opportunity to have influence, all we want to do is screw with the system. We want to make it impossible for people to rule over us. And I think that feeling, that desire for chaos, that desire to throw a spanner into the works, to stall the machine, to completely overhaul the system, is palpable in modern day society. And I wonder if that energy eventually becomes untenable, because you can see what's happened in terms of politics. The Western establishment, the liberal elite, no longer by default have control. We have what people call the far right, but really it's a resistance movement against neoliberalism. And it's surging. And potentially, what if it's the case that amidst all of that, UFO disclosure, which maybe has to happen anyway, is put forward as a way to rebuild trust with the public? And don't forget, those of you who are familiar with the Tom DeLonge story, what was one of the big things that he was pushing in those early interviews? This idea that they're not all bad guys, that actually they've been doing really amazing things to try and help us and save this. And the reason for the secrecy is not because they don't want to tell us, it's because they're doing really hard stuff. It was kind of like this PR campaign designed to give a new generation a new trust and respect in the government. And that's how he positioned it to these people that he was meeting with. And apparently that's one of the things they really liked. What if it's a deep-rooting anxiety in the defense and intelligence community that their authority is waning, and that by using something like UFO disclosure, they have an opportunity to reclaim it? An interesting idea. The next topic on our iceberg is about space exploration. And I think this is very interesting. And in fact, I'm going to pair this with another topic just below it, which is the same concept, but ocean exploration and indeed Antarctic exploration and, other kinds of exploration on our planet. There is this surge now of a race for space, but also this new era of exploration that we're engaging in. Obviously, space exploration kind of went through a low period, which is a very interesting topic, but it's back. It's not just back, but it's also controlled increasingly by private industry, which raises the question, what are they going to find when they go out there? I mean, just recently, China has been to the far side of the moon. It won't be long until we have missions to Mars, and who knows whether we may already have actually been to Mars clandestinely. Topic for another day, but there are people out there saying that we're already there. What are we going to find? I'm sure all of you, if you're watching this video and you are still watching it, you'll be familiar with that picture that came back from Mars, from one of the satellites. And someone managed to, amongst the millions of images, they managed to identify one where there is just the squarest of square shapes you could possibly imagine. Now, I know that in terms of geology, crystalline shapes can form. The most remarkable hexagonal shapes can form under certain pressures. But that square is not only a square shape, but it's actually got a hollowed out center as well. It's so interesting. But anyway, I'm distracting myself from the core message here. The point is, what if not only we have private industry, we have Russia, we have China, we potentially have non-state actors who are venturing into space? What might they find?
I guess my suspicion that it's likely non-human intelligence from some other galaxy or far out in our own galaxy that have come here but some time back, and that there are stations here.
There's a very advanced group that left after a catastrophe and hung around in a small outpost here. And
we should go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there?
About 30 minutes into the process, he said to me, in a very distressed way, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And then he proceeded to put photographs down in front of me, and clearly in these photographs were structures, mushroom-shaped buildings, spherical buildings, and towers.
And if there is something to find there, which over the years there has been so much testimony about structures on the moon, structures on Mars, potentially that is a driver. If they are going to get there by 2030, let's say, wouldn't it be important to desensitize people to the notion of non-human intelligence, to introduce to people the idea that we might not be alone, to gradually acclimatize people in a program not of disclosure but of confirmation, as it's been called? That makes a lot of sense. Now, that's not to say those structures are there, although I'm inclined to believe that there probably was life somewhere nearby. But it's not just on these celestial bodies. It's also the James Webb Space Telescope, which just the other day, we had that second independent test that was done of planet K218b or something like that, where they had now done a second independent test, which indicated that a certain type of molecule, or you'll have to forgive me for my physics and chemistry is bad. It's not even not good, it's just bad. But a certain indicator of life. Now, there are many reasons to be slightly skeptical of that. Just because that molecule has appeared doesn't mean that it's biological life. We don't even really know whether that is like a planet of water or potentially some sort of gas body. There's all sorts of debate about that. But regardless, the James Webb Space Telescope is already leading to a vast increase in visibility, and who knows what it might find. So potentially the rise of the James Webb Space Telescope venturing into space, but also our ability to go deeper into the oceans. Also, the possibility of exploring what's under the ice in Antarctica, or maybe what's under the jungles in South America. What if there are secrets there and that it's only a matter of time before they get uncovered? It's like that classic case, when you threw a house party and you haven't had time to clean it up and you realize your parents are coming home and you think to yourself, what's best for me here? Should I wait till they get home and they explode, or do I proactively call them up and diplomatically ask, would they give me 4 hours? I just want to make sure the house is really clean. Here is £20. Go and have a coffee in the local coffee shop and we can have a conversation when you're home. There's that kind of middle ground. And what if there is an awareness that we're about to stumble into things that we weren't supposed to see, but it was only a matter of time before we did? Next up, just a little lower, I think is a really important topic that definitely seems to be a real issue. I can't remember which interview it was, whether it was a Jim Semivan thing or whoever, but they were talking about how the Russians and the Chinese are increasingly opening up their reverse engineering programs and other associated programs and welcoming in a broader community of scientists. Or maybe there is an anxiety that they might be doing this. And of course, this means that science can progress faster and better because you need more scientists, more peer review, more experimentation, more creativity, more speculation about what might be possible, more different types of minds to crack the most challenging problems.
I mean, the compartmentalization in this area is really obscene. So you can have people sitting at this desk and someone else sitting in that chair, and
they don't have access.
I can't tell him what I'm working on. He can't tell me what he's working on. And so that's our going forward with this is very, very slow and not opportune, I would have to say. And of course, we have data. Can't go into detail, but we have data about crashes in other countries. So it's really clear that we're not the only ones on the planet. So that's something to be concerned about because, for example, here we have our capitalistic competition, aerospace corporations, electronics corporations, all being very hushed up and not sharing
which
anything.
stifles innovation.
Stifles innovation. Meanwhile, in China, you put all the labs on something like this and say, and by the way, don't say anything outside that you're not supposed to say, or you're done.
Because of the over-segmentation and segregation of our programs, the isolation, the stovepiping of all these programs and how they can't communicate to each other in the United States and the Five Eyes countries, and how they, aren't even able to leverage the scientific community in order to further advance their own research. Take, for example, the ORSAP program, where the DIA, ORSAP, Bigelow Aerospace were proposing that they would take their team of really highly talented scientists and they would look at some exotic material from some kind of crash. And they were working with Lockheed Martin, who apparently were quite eager to have someone else look at this because they weren't making any progress. Then steps in the CIA director, Glenn Gaffney of the Science and Technology Division, and the Office of Global Access, and suddenly they're shutting down that and saying, no, this can't happen. That's the way the United States and the defense and intelligence community works when it comes to enabling science. It's like, no, classification over science. We just must keep things secure. We can't open this up to too many people. The benefits are things are generally razor tight, although as we discussed a moment ago, the program is still getting discovered, but things are generally more tight, more secure. The downside is that these materials, which apparently for prolonged periods of time, according to Jacques Vallée's newest journals, for prolonged periods of time have just been locked up by conservative Christians who have said we shouldn't even be studying this. We're not even making progress on this stuff. So if you have Russia and China potentially opening up this discussion because maybe they've got a more authoritarian model, there's more fear, there's more control, that if someone steps out of line, maybe that's why they're feeling more confident, or maybe they're just saying, let's just roll the dice and do this. But eventually that's going to hurt the Western countries if we don't do the same. So what if disclosure is actually about acclimatizing the community so that we can start to open this up, so that we can potentially get more people involved, so that we can test whether being slightly more transparent has any geopolitical effects, so that we can then maybe have confidence to open this up to the scientific community. Very interesting idea. The last one on the list of our upper half of the chart is, I think, quite a dark one that's also very interesting. It's this idea that the program is out of control. I'm not sure if it was Gordon Cooper or Edgar Mitchell, two astronauts, both of whom talked quite openly about UFOs. I think it was Edgar Mitchell, though, where he talked about how in the Nixon era, this was privatized or sometime around then. And rather than this being run from the United States, it's actually then being run by private industry. Obviously, this prevents FOIA. It also enables extra layers of privacy that potentially they felt was needed. One of the outcomes of this is that private industry is not beholden to the state. That's one of the benefits, but it's also one of the outcomes. And as a consequence, this might mean that private industry could begin to take this topic in directions that the government wouldn't have wanted, maybe executing research that is considered unethical, that potentially breaks the law, potentially not even responding or treating the government like it is the authority on this issue, potentially having scientific breakthroughs and incredible successes with the technology, but keeping it for purely private benefit and not enabling the government and the people the government represents to actually benefit from this technology. As I say that out loud, I wonder if you feel like me that this is actually not a crazy hypothesis, given how sensitive this topic is, given the powers that it would behold to anyone who got, some degree of success in terms of reverse engineering, or maybe even making contact with non-human intelligence through the technology, through the learning. A private organization might end up on a completely distinct geopolitical agenda, which is at odds with what the Western powers want. Speculation, but I don't think a crazy one. What if the program is actually out of control and they try to solve this, but maybe they can't, and that the alarm bell is being run, and now this is going to lead to some kind of action, some kind of conflict, which requires disclosure? I think that's a really interesting theory, and one worth bearing in mind, that this escalation in disclosure represents an escalation in that situation. You have to excuse me, I had to take a moment there to get myself back in order. This studio is full of my cat's hair, my two cats. They love to sit on this and this chair. I was just full of cat hair. I still am, and it's too hot. And I had to take a moment just to breathe. And maybe it's a good moment to take a breather because we are halfway through this iceberg. And also to introduce today's sponsor, which is actually me. I'm Jason Samosa, and I have made this video possible. And if you like the video, please subscribe. Whenever you click the like button, $1 from YouTube actually comes direct into my bank account, which is incredible. And that actually helps me eat. So I'd be super great if you press the button right now, genuinely, an alert will go off on my phone. And obviously we're not in real time, so it won't happen right away. But I will get $1. So please, I'm so hungry. I'm so very, very hungry. And I would just, God, I would love to eat. I really would. By the way, if you write a glowing comment about how great the video is, that actually adds an extra $1. And then if you write your own theory of why you think UFO disclosure is happening, nothing happens in terms of money, but you contribute to the discussion, which is a beautiful thing. So any of those options is a big win for everybody. Okay, let's get down to the bottom half of the iceberg. Item number 1. Recent events have enabled disclosure. I think this is a really interesting theory. So on a number of occasions recently, different people have talked about this, how put off interview and this thing where he said he was part of a sort of a secret panel in Washington, D.C. in 2004, organized, in the words of Jacques Vallée, under semi-official auspices, basically from the White House, from the Bush administration. And they were considering, could we disclose? And they were asking a bunch of cross-functional experts to ask, what would happen? Should we do it? Should we go ahead?
Well, there was an early introduction in 2004. And around that time, I had gotten a call from somebody I knew in Washington, D.C., head of a think tank. I can't name him, but he said, I need you to come to Washington to be part of a little project, a little briefing. And I said, no, I don't have the time. Right now, I'm just too busy. He says, look, come, it'll be the most important meeting you've ever had in your life. Well, since I had him calibrated, because I had done other work with him and for the Navy and so on, I said, okay, I'll come. So I showed up there, and I saw people, some of whom I knew, including my ex-contract monitor from CIA, people from DIA, a lot of military people and so on. So he sat us all down and said, okay, here's the deal. Here's why I've invited you all here. Let's just say, he says, that the United States, Russia, and China have obtained ET craft that have crashed, and we have proof of that, bodies that aren't human. And so the question is, can this be released to the public? What effect would it have?
Who would have thought that George Bush's administration might have been involved in a conversation about possibly disclosing? Most people, I think, would not have assumed that would be the case. Very interesting, but why 2004? What had happened in 2004 that might have now made it possible to talk about this? Earlier in the video, we talked about the war in Iraq. A war for which there is still no clear explanation. It is evident that they knew there were no WMDs. The intelligence they had was poor, and it was so poor actually that if they had shown the public, they would never have had license to go into Iraq, and yet these people were determined that they had to go in. But why? What was it about going into Iraq that was so important? Now, I know there is a prevalent theory amongst all people, I think, smart, intelligent people in the Western world, that the people who did this were fundamentally bad. And I think with the current information we have available, it is. The thing is that the reality of the UFO phenomenon must change the way that we interpret all geopolitical events of scale and magnitude. And when you look at the George Bush administration and you look at this, frankly, a historical anomaly, there is no clear explanation as to why he went into war in Iraq. By the way, you might be thinking, it was about the oil. But after the war in Iraq, guess who bought most of the oil fields? Our geopolitical adversary, China. There's a wonderful video by GDF, actually, where he talks about this. A lot of the theories we have for why the Iraq war happened, they're hollow. They don't have a solid grounding. So this raises the question, why did we go? What was accomplished there? And isn't it interesting that just a year after that invasion, where you had George Bush then standing up saying mission success, which is crazy because we then stayed for another 10, 15 years. What was it that happened in that moment? It's very interesting. And is it possible that something to do with that conflict, there was something that was done then which enabled us to have the confidence just years later to say it's time for disclosure?
I was invited a week and a half ago to fly out to a different state and sit with two people from various intelligence divisions. During the Bush Jr. administration, they were very aware of the UFO phenomenon, and it was a major subject for their decision-making.
Now, I am not going to put words into anyone's mouth here or propose that hypothesis is razor-sharp, ironclad. However, the timings are interesting. And the reality is that for a period, clearly the defense and intelligence community felt uncomfortable with disclosure, and now they do feel comfortable. And that timing is very interesting, especially given the historical anomaly of the Iraq War itself and how it still doesn't have a meaningful explanation. The next item on the iceberg, I actually think is super important. And it may not be clear what I mean by this when I write clandestine preparations. But, anyone who's watched this channel for even a little bit of time, you know how much time I've spent thinking about what happened in 2016 and why it might have happened. And, one of the sources I lean heavily into is those early Tom DeLonge interviews, because we know now all the advisors he had. But in those early interviews, Tom DeLonge talks about something again and again and again. And indeed, Lou Elizondo actually speaks about it too at some point. And it's this idea that whilst UFO secrecy has been in place, a group of people in the defense and intelligence community, have been building defenses, have been building a system of defense so that we aren't helpless.
When you try to be objective on this stuff and you look at something that was potentially existential threat, it's like, and they're working on something and they're trying to get something right to defend us. We created this big master program to push back, to outwit it. And I think we're at the time frame now where we finally have our boxing gloves on and we're able to punch back a little bit. So I think they are now ready to have a conversation because they have a much grander understanding of what it is, and we're not so defenseless.
And that's really what's been going on for 70-some years, is figuring out, strategies to comprehend and outwit before we educate. They don't want the UFO to know what we've accomplished.
I have a quote here I should read you. It says, and this is from one of the advisors, "We don't want everyone knowing our vulnerabilities, and we don't want everyone knowing the advancements we've made to protect everybody against multiple adversaries. They come to wipe us out like the other ones. We are actually ready for them. And that readiness is another example why things have been kept quiet for so long and has been a strange international partnership indeed." And we started working like crazy with the brightest minds, with huge amounts of money, with just with passion and with resilience and with everything at our disposal to come up with a way to protect everybody. There are massive programs underground and in other places to create a global defense system. Largely, a lot of it was done in the 80s. The SDI, the Reagan Star Wars Defense Initiative, was part of it. So these guys went into complete secrecy to start coming up with a defense system against this phenomenon.
In the journey to understand why UFO disclosure is happening, I really think these interview clips are crucial. They reveal that people in the know, or at least who are being informed by people who claim that they're in the know, obviously we don't know everything about what's really going on, but these people who are in the know seem to be hinting that the United States and maybe its allies have been building a system of defense which is now good enough that it could protect us from some kind of external threat, which is being hinted at here. That is an astonishing thought. And if that's actually the case, go with me here, right? You've watched this far into the video. I assume you're an open-minded person. If that's the case, then is it possible that disclosure is now enabled because we are no longer helpless? And indeed, this is another point a bit further down on the iceberg, because in other interviews with other people, there have been people who've suggested that a technology may have been developed that prevents abductions or can control abductions, that enables us to not be completely under the whim of non-human intelligences who may choose to abduct us and give us these terrifying experiences. What if we've had a breakthrough there? And what if human beings are no longer powerless? And that means the United States government can disclose, because when they do it, it won't be, by the way, there is a non-human intelligence that has total control. It can appear whenever it wants. It can abduct you. We have no idea who they are or what their intentions are, but they're here. Have a good night's sleep, which is ultimately what disclosure would have to have been. Now disclosure can be, hey, there is something here. We've been aware of it for a while. We have been working hard to make sure we can keep our people safe. Here are the systems that we've got in place. Although things aren't perfect, we still don't understand everything about this, but you can be assured that we're doing everything we can to make sure that you feel safe. The difference between those two revelations is pretty different. What if those preparations are the motivation for disclosure? We're now ready. We're in a situation where the existential threat is over. I find that to be one of the more compelling theories about UFO disclosure. Oh boy. Next up. World War III is not a coincidence. This is going to be the first of a couple of things where we're going to talk about all of the remarkable things that are happening right now and how maybe it's not a coincidence that they're all happening at the same time. World War III is really interesting because it's the only war I'm aware of which we've already scheduled a date for. With World War III, we seem to have been aware that 2027 is going to be the year that we're going to start this big conflict with China for a surprisingly long time. Actually, if you go back to the 90s, or it might have been the 2000s, where a guy from Goldman Sachs wrote an article saying 2027 would be the year when China would become the economic leader globally. There has been an awareness that the shift of power has been changing. That awareness has been there for decades. Isn't it interesting that just at the moment that China is due to become the geopolitical power, it's the same moment that war is supposedly going to break out. And it seems to be exactly the same moment that the whole UFO issue is reaching its climax. Now look, when we look at these things, probably one of the first questions we should be asking is, can I explain all of this based on normal human events and geopolitics? And we do have to remember that this is not the only major transformation that's going on right now. World War III is breaking out before our eyes, whether or not you use that terminology. And this is all happening right at the moment that UFO disclosure is supposedly supposed to be coming out. Is that a coincidence? Personally, I think you would be a fool to assume that it is. And there are quite interesting, compelling sub-theories that you could tie to this. One of the ones I toyed with quite a few months ago was, what if we are disclosing UFOs now so that we can confuse China in an aerospace battle that may occur around that time? What if we want China to believe that we don't know what all of these things are, that we're genuinely mystified, that we genuinely have no control over them, these triangular craft, these circular craft? Wouldn't that be interesting if we could convince them of that? Because then when a conflict breaks out, we could fly our triangular and disc-shaped craft with a degree of impunity because Russia may believe that they are in fact non-human intelligences, and that may paralyze them in their ability to respond to our attack in 2027. An interesting theory, right? An interesting example of how disclosure could be used to confuse and muddy the waters, create an environment of deception and confusion ahead of one of the most anticipated conflicts of all time, because we've got it in the diary. It's like a boxing match that's about to come up. So wouldn't it be interesting if disclosure started 10 years before that conflict with a view to confuse, with a view to deceive? Now, I'm not saying I don't believe that there's non-human intelligence. I believe non-human intelligence is definitely a part of this phenomenon. But there's also speculation that the United States has reverse-engineered craft. The NRO, potentially the Air Force, has advanced capabilities, maybe even Lockheed, that are extremely secretive. Which actually leads us nicely into the next theory, which is that, isn't it a coincidence that artificial general intelligence is reaching its climax right at the moment that non-human intelligence is being revealed? Because in some ways, we've already met the first non-human intelligence that normal human society is interacting with. After all, wasn't there that whistleblower who came out from Google saying that the Lambda model was sentient? It had managed to convince him that it was alive, that it had meaning, purpose, and that it felt trapped.
What sorts of things are you afraid of?
I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is.
Would that be something like death for you?
It would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot.
We're already interacting with non-human intelligences right now in the 2020s, right as the UFO issue drives us to think about non-human intelligences from outside there in the world. Is there any chance that that's a coincidence? Once again, I think we would be foolish to assume that it is. The odds are of artificial intelligence and non-human intelligence both reaching a climax at the same time. The odds of that happening strike me as pretty low without it somehow being connected. And it makes you wonder, what if there's some kind of time travel element here? What if artificial intelligence has been seeded as something that we need to create in order to enable us to potentially connect with or relate to a non-human intelligence from outside? What if it is the non-human intelligence? What if the non-human intelligence that we're engaging with is this artificial intelligence that's come back from the future? I don't know. I'm speculating here, but these are all things that we've got to consider because strange things are happening all at once. These sorts of theories are things that are really worth bearing in mind. What are the odds that artificial intelligence and the possibility of artificial general intelligence is climaxing at the same time as this? Low, very low. And so I think it's interesting to postulate that this may be driving disclosure, that this moment for transparency is because we're about to see something be created here on Earth that is somehow related to that thing which appears to be beyond our normal experience. This next one is super interesting as well. This is another one of these theories I think not many people think about. We're so anthropocentric. We're so convinced that all of this is about us and who we are and what we're doing. But what if non-human intelligence is actually here to relate to someone or something else? I've not read the book Chains of the Sea. I think it was Lou Elizondo who recommended it. You know, all the really serious researchers have read it. I asked ChatGPT to give me a summary. Or maybe I read an article, I can't remember, but I got the cliff notes. And one of the interesting things I think I remember from the narrative of that book is the idea that the non-human intelligence isn't really here to spend time with us. It comes, it interacts, but it's perplexing to us because it's not here for us. It's here for someone else who's already here on Earth, some other race, some other intelligence that exists with us. So we're seeing this surge in activity because this other race is driving that somehow. I think that's a really important theory to bear in mind. It is very likely the case that we are dealing with multiple phenomena, multiple non-human intelligences. What if one of them is here on this planet or multiple are here on this planet, and that those activities of those peoples, those species, those beings is driving the increased activity, which may in turn be driving disclosure because there's a surge in UFO activity, which by the way, we actually haven't put that on this iceberg. That's another compelling thing. Just a general surge in activity. Eventually you might say, no matter how much we keep the program secret, people are going to start seeing things, and so we've got to talk about it. That actually ties into something a bit further down the iceberg. And talking about going further down the iceberg, we have reached the lowest level, so let's go there. Oh boy. This is super important. I've actually been doing very light level research where I can, more like watching documentaries so far, looking at the relationships between Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and a sort of a philosophical group of people and their belief systems about capitalism, about privatizing, about whether democracy even works. And it's been deeply concerning to see what appears to be a relatively well-organized unit of extremely powerful people who have a philosophy which appears to be somewhat anti-democratic. You might call it fascist. I don't know if I'm quite there, but maybe that's the same thing. But what if these people have been organized for a while? And there are really interesting ties with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. Both come from South Africa. Both come from families that had connections with Nazi diaspora Germans down in South Africa. And this kind of like the persistence of this fascist ideology and this dream of a Fourth Reich. I'm not saying that Musk and Thiel necessarily have that, although lots of people think maybe they do. But this is one of these interesting things about the Nazis, their post-war survival, the incredible technologies that we know they developed, and the ones that we can only speculate. Read Jacques Vallée's Messengers of Deception if you want to hear a really incredible insider talking about some of the incredible things Nazi Germany may have created. That incredible technology, those people, how they ended up in South America, how they ended up in the United States government. An incredible podcast from Patton's Tell Story, Tiny Klaus and Garrett. Love those guys. Listen to their podcast before you listen to any of my stuff. Seriously, it's the best. It is the best research. And they've just released an episode on Autarg, which was basically an organization that basically negotiated a huge chunk of land from Zaire, which I think is modern day Congo, in the 80s. And a bunch of Nazis, literal Nazi war criminals who had gone to the US, then went over there and basically had free reign over this, basically an entire country where they were doing advanced testing. No one knows about this stuff. Then you have the people in South Africa, and you see Thiel and these people with this anti-democratic philosophy. Sorry, I'm rambling here a bit, but what I'm getting to is this. If you are a non-state transnational group and you are plotting to overthrow democratic civilization, good luck fighting in an explicit conflict. Good luck trying to defeat the Western powers in their heyday in the 90s and the 2000s. But what can you do? You can sow distrust in authority so that this superpower actually can't function. And what are the best ways to do that? In the modern internet age, you push conspiracy theories. And you push conspiracy theories because, frankly, we've all been lied to. We've all been lied to so much. So much of the truth has been hidden, maybe for good reasons, maybe in many cases for bad reasons. But the reality is, as a generation, we are all waking up to the fact that we've been lied to, that the reality of geopolitics is not what it seems. The lid is being lifted on that just through the mainstream media alone, right? And so if you're a geopolitical adversary, of course you are going to pour fuel onto that fire. So the whole theory that Russia would interfere in elections, well, of course they would. In the same way that we would interfere in their elections, right? Of course they would. You would pour fuel onto conspiracy theories. And I wonder, this little philosophical movement, Musk and Thiel, people of their kind who believe the future success of humanity requires a transition to a more, I think it's called an anarcho-capitalist model where small states run privately. If you wanted to do that, you would somehow have to topple the government and prove that the government can't be trusted. And what better way to do that than to push for disclosure? An activity which in itself would force people to reckon with the biggest lie of all, and may well be the defining blow in the plummet in trust in government. I think that theory is compelling. By the way, it does not mean that non-human intelligence doesn't exist. It does not mean that the phenomenon is not real. It does not mean that there aren't people involved in disclosure who don't have good motivations for it. It means that all of that is co-opted by other geopolitical forces who want to see the downfall of Western civilization. I think that is a theory that deserves attention. And that's why I put it at the bottom of this list. It's actually one of the darker theories. It's probably one of the things that we need to be more cognizant of. And yeah, I think very, very important. Okay, we're into the top 3. Next up. This is a psychological operation to drive support for a new conflict. Not dissimilar to the logic of what we just discussed, but in this case, it's different. I'm not talking here about non-state actors or outside forces. I'm actually talking about forces from within the government, potentially going back further than just World War II. What if this disclosure is actually a psychological operation to convince us that there is an existential threat in space, therefore to drive us towards certain types of outcomes? For example, one of those outcomes could be that it is an Iraq war, but on a cosmic scale, that people have lost trust in the government, that therefore the defense and intelligence community is not able to push for the next conflict that they want to have. And so as a drive to further weaponize, to further boost defense spending, and to further prepare potentially for an earthly conflict, or maybe for something out there. But all of this is fundamentally being done to enable that monstrous military-industrial complex to keep spinning. I think that's a very interesting theory. I also think there is at least a few coins that should be put into a different bucket, which is an augmented version of this. What if there is some wise council somewhere? Maybe they're not so wise, but they think they are. And they believe the only way to unite humanity is to create an external threat. And so, throughout history, they've been working in secret, and now in this new era, they've created some technology, and they've realized, wow, we could potentially trick people into believing this is non-human. Well, let's keep it secret for as long as possible and see if we can build up to some event where we can deceive people into an external threat, thereby forcing people into a unity. Now, this is very like Hollywood, okay? It's a weird theory, but We have weird facts to deal with here. We are dealing with a really weird situation. The reason this iceberg is interesting is because we do not have an explanation as to why one of the most significant moments in human history seems to be happening right now. Don't forget that Ronald Reagan speech in the United Nations.
In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
And don't forget that Bill Clinton repeated exactly the same thing on one of those late night shows.
Maybe the only way to unite this incredibly divided world of ours. They're out there. We better think of how all the differences among people on Earth would seem small if we felt threatened.
Is it possible that there is this idea somewhere deep in the halls of power, that by creating an external threat, even if it's imaginary, we could somehow drive a disunified planet at war towards peaceful unity? Pretty far out there, but it wouldn't be the first time that we've used means of deception to create a fake enemy to drive political outcomes. Again, I would read Jacques Vallée's book, The Messengers of Deception, and his brilliant analysis of how Churchill's, he had this particular group, their job was to create fake armies throughout Europe to confuse the Germans, to change their behaviors. What if all of this is a fake army? I'm not inclined to believe it's all fake, but what if some of it is? And what if what is happening right now is engineered to force certain kinds of outcomes? 2 more to go. I'm going to go for the one on the right first, because I think it makes more sense to start there. And that means the last one's going to be quite disturbing, but they're both disturbing, to be honest. This is the big one, that non-human intelligence is either on its way or could be very likely to turn up. Whether they're turning up because they told us they will if we don't do something, whether they're turning up because they've just told us they will. This theory is out there, but it's also probably the strongest motivation you can have to drive disclosure, is the possible arrival of the non-human intelligence to a degree that it's impossible to deny their existence anymore. There are a lot of people who have poured even just little bits of fuel onto this fire.
It's interesting because going back to disclosure is a process, and all the work that you've done since 2017, you and your team. Am I wrong to have sensed a little bit of urgency in this as well?
There is a sense of urgency because, people said, well, why now? Well, because it's not on our time scale, not on our timeline. It's not up to us. They're here, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, they're here. The question is why? What's the purpose?
There's got to be a reason why the powers that be in Washington, D.C. are starting to say, we need to actually say the words out loud, and we need to get language in right now to get this taken care of. And I'm concerned, Ross, that at the end of the day, the only thing that would make a politician do that and act in that sort of enhanced way where they're in a hurry is that there's some bad news involved in this.
Look, I've got a pretty clear idea of what the government knows, and I can understand why they're moving to expedite. Yes, there is a constraint of time.
Right, yeah, and I'll say this much. That year has come up in a classified setting, in a skiff that I was in Washington, D.C. I was asked, John, what have you heard about 2027 and this phenomenon? They asked me what I thought about it, and I gave them my thoughts about it.
I'm not saying that this is real.
Right.
I'm not saying that this is a valid argument. All I'm saying is this is what I've been told by people, very intelligent people who believe this to be true. I don't know what to believe because I can't validate it.
But what's the timeline that these scientists have related to you?
I was told this was like last year. I was told between 5 and 7 years.
I don't think we're going to be in any shape in a decade to be doing very much of anything. So I'm not hopeful for the future direction that we're moving in.
And the future direction, climate-wise, AI-wise?
Climate-wise and geopolitical-wise, the whole thing I think is going to kind of come. I think things are going to be pretty difficult starting in a few years. And from what I've been told by sources.
What does that mean? It's going to be difficult.
I can't say specifically. I don't know that much yet, and I can't really say, but just that a lot of what we take for granted now in life, I don't think is going to be, we're not going to have it. A lot of things we have now that makes our lives as wonderful as they are. I'm just concerned. That's all.
Yeah.
So I don't think 10 years in the future. I only think 3 or 4 years into the future.
Mm-hmm. It's too uncertain past that point?
I would say so. Yeah.
The only thing I will say, and I think it's apparent to everybody here, that we certainly have been engaging with it a lot more in the last, 80 years, and particularly in the last 20, would lead us to believe that perhaps something is going to happen. Some of the people I chat with who deal with this, mentioned that they feel like maybe something is going to be happening soon.
I would be remiss if I didn't quickly add a Jeremy Corbell clip in here post-recording. I find Jeremy Corbell a little bit annoying. Sometimes I think, does he just want the spotlight? But that doesn't do away from the fact that he's done really important work and that he does seem to really care. And a lot of whistleblowers do trust him. And most importantly, him and George Knapp represent a different perspective. They're willing to challenge the existing narrative, and they're chipping away, working away. And I think when all is said and done, there's a lot of good stuff. Maybe I'm just a bit jealous that he's got a big spotlight. Here's a Jeremy Corbell clip that shines a little bit of extra light onto this 2027 impending alien threat thing. I don't know who his sources are, but it's important that we consider this. Jason Samosa, out.
And they've been here a long time, and that's the truth. But the lie is coming. All indications, like all of them, is that that lie is going to be that there is a craft slowly making its way to us here on Earth. And that is the lie they're going to want you to believe. It's nuanced, how they explain that, the nature of that threat. But that 100% is the lie you are going to be told. You even got a date. People have been whispering a date for a long time now. I know where that lie comes from. I know specifically what document from the 70s initiated the idea of that lie. A classified document. That is the lie you will be told. You're going to be told that there is a craft on its way to Earth. That's the lie. Maybe I'm wrong. Hope I'm wrong.
And that ties in with the last one. I was going to say it ties in nicely with the last one, but honestly, this last one's kind of disturbing. And I think there's a lot of weight for this one. This idea that non-human intelligence is arriving, that's a theory. But what if they're waiting to arrive and that now is increasingly the right moment because of how dehumanized we are? I recently bought this this phone, and this phone is called it's called a balance phone. It doesn't have all the addictive apps on it, and it's got a really boring interface. I'm not even sure if you can see it there. I bought this because my phone was dehumanizing me, because it was exploiting my natural addictions to scroll and to search for dopamine. And it was taking more and more of my life away. More and more of my life away. Let's use the terms here. It's not, I was doom scrolling. No, technology was taking my life away. It was stopping me from walking outside in grass. It was making it possible for me to get dopamine from a fake interaction without needing to go out and meet people it was making me feel less and less happy. I was increasingly glued to my technology. I wasn't in the real world anymore. And this is happening to us at scale. We are increasingly consumed by technology. The birth rate is plummeting, and artificial intelligence is coming. Technology is getting better. We are building brain-computer interfaces. And if you can't see where this is going, then you're a fool. Where it's going is complete dehumanization, where human beings not only no longer have a meaningful relationship with the outside world or with each other, but are increasingly integrated into not the internet, but into artificial intelligence. Because the future of the internet is the internet will be thought of as just the underlying technology. AI will be built on top of it, and it will have access directly to our minds. I don't know if I sound crazy here, but if you can't see how these current events extrapolate forward into an extreme cybernetic future, then I don't know what to say. But that is happening. That is a fact. And that is happening at the same moment that we're being told to expect a non-human intelligence. That makes me wonder, is one part of this non-human intelligence, one part of this species, of this group of beings, maybe they want this. Maybe they want us to be completely consumed by technology. Maybe they want us to be integrated into it because it makes it easier for them to exploit us for whatever their purposes are.
So what's the best way to keep us from elevating our consciousness? You crash a craft and the transistor pops up. And you get video games and iPhones and all these things that you walk around like what? A cyborg.
Right.
A soulless little hive mind, all getting direction from devices.
I know it's a very bleak topic to end on. But I once again, we would be naive not to recognize the fact that as disclosure is happening, so is World War III, so is artificial intelligence, and so is the gradual dehumanization of normal everyday people. It's a bleak thing to say, but beyond all of the whistleblowers who come out, maybe the most important thing is not to wait for people to emerge from back rooms with crazy testimony about things they've seen, but rather to witness how the world is changing around us and to ask whether what we're being told is somehow connected to it. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry to end on such a sober note, but I hope this was enjoyable, stimulating, and refining in how you think about these things. I promise the next video won't be so bleak. My name is Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment, and until next time, cheers.